Good afternoon. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to present some of my research on the political economy of growth models. I'm going to be talking about mostly about four advanced countries, Germany, Italy, the UK, and Sweden, but hopefully with some implications for Western countries in general, and in particular the period, the 15 years before the crisis. And this is going to be at a fairly high level of generality, unfortunately. I won't go into any details. And I'm going to talk first about common trends of capitalist economies and then peculiarities, and the peculiarities are going to be the growth models. So the common trends, in my view, are three. First, there is a common trend of liberalization, which is most visible if you look at industrial relations or labor market institutions. Everywhere you see trade union rates going down, collective bargaining coverage shrinking, the level of collective bargaining moving from the national or the sectoral level to the enterprise level, and then you see reduction of employment protection, but you also see similar trends of liberalization in the welfare state or corporate governance. That's the first common trend. The second trend is a distributional shift away from labor income towards profit income. This is the decline of the labor share, which is well attested. And the third trend is a trouble that virtually all capitalist economies have, producing adequate levels of aggregate demand. The levels of aggregate demand that are needed to employ all factors of production, particularly labor. And this is known as the debate about secular stagnation. Now, these three trends overlap in time. They happen at the same time, and I'm going to argue, very speculatively, that they are causally related. Namely, liberalization of protective institutions is responsible for the distributional shift, which in turn is responsible for the problem of inadequate or deficient aggregate demand. This graph is difficult to read. These are the G7 countries. On the vertical axis, you have the labor share, so the share of GDP that goes to labor income and income of the self-employed. And if you were to disentangle all these lines, you would see that the trend is declining everywhere. The peak is 1975 approximately for Japan, 1975 for the United Kingdom. The peak in Germany is later on. Anyways, in all these countries, there is this distributional shift that I talked about. Income is shifting from labor income to capital and rents. Now, in order to understand these common trends and what follows from them, we have to shift from an emphasis on describing institutions, which is typical in my field. My field is political economy and economic sociology, asking to what extent institutions are still different across countries or they are converging. And we have to move we have to put aggregate demand back to the center stage, i.e. we have to go back to Keynes, the old Keynes. The problem of aggregate demand, the level of aggregate demand, and the composition of aggregate demand has to become paramount again. Then I borrow a piece from Kalecki. Kalecki is an economist of the early post-war period, almost completely ignored these days. And one main insight of Kalecki was the idea that the level of demand depends on distribution. And in particular, if distribution shifts too much away from labor income towards profit income, you're going to have a problem of deficient aggregate demand somewhere, i.e. income is going to be used not so much to purchase goods and services, rather increasingly to purchase financial assets. So you're going to have an increased demand for assets, which will chase then returns, and there's going to be a financialization cycle that gets into play. And the third step comes again from Kalecki. Distribution is not a consequence of technology. It's not technology that shapes the distribution of income. It is politics, particularly social power. And for Kalecki, it was class power. In my framework, it's not just class power, it's sectoral power, more importantly, and I will talk more about that. So if there is this, if there is this shift in the distribution of income, you're going to have a problem of potentially deficient aggregate demand, and this is where diversity comes in. This problem of deficient aggregate demand is addressed differently by different countries. So in some countries, the problem of deficient aggregate demand is addressed by stimulating consumption through alternative means, by rendering access to credit, to debt, easier than it was before. Another solution is to replace deficient domestic demand with aggregate demand. This is going to be the export-led growth model, but there's also the possibility that the problem is never addressed. So stagnation remains a possibility. And so in a highly stylized fashion, I distinguish between 4 growth models, 4 answers to the common problem of potentially deficient aggregate demand. The consumption-led growth model, that's exemplified by the UK, the export-led growth model, that's Germany, a combination of the two, a very interesting one, both consumption and export-led growth in Sweden, and then the problem of not finding an alternative driver. So you have neither consumption nor export-led growth model, and that's, according to my analysis, the problem of Italy. Let me give you a sense, through descriptive statistics, that there are differences in the level and composition of aggregate demand in these countries. This is the contribution of net exports to growth in the 4 countries between 1994 and 2007, so the 15 years before the crisis in 5-year averages. Look at the orange bar. You see that the contribution of net trade to British growth is negative, and sometimes strongly negative. The contribution of net exports to Italian growth, that's the red bar, is essentially 0. So net exports do not contribute on average to Italian growth. The green bar is Sweden, and that's a contribution which is remarkable. It's declining over time, but it's still non-negligible. And then look at the blue bar. This should be well known. The contribution of net exports to German growth is negligible in the second half of the 90s and then grows continuously. And we will see it's the main, if not the only, contributor to German growth in the 15 years before the crisis. That's the contribution of final private consumption to growth. Again, 5-year averages. Here you see that the yellow bar, the UK, it indicates strong contribution of household consumption to British growth. So let me recap. Negative contribution of trade, strongly positive contribution of household consumption. Sweden also has an important role being played by household consumption. So Sweden is a case where you have growth both pulled by net exports and by household consumption. The blue line is Germany. Contribution negligible to begin with, that becomes virtually non-existent. So as German growth becomes more and more export-led, the contribution of household consumption goes down. And the Italian pattern looks like the German one. More important contribution in the late 90s, which becomes smaller towards the end. So to recap. UK grow. First of all, the UK and Sweden grow faster than Italy and Germany. UK, export consumption-led growth. Sweden, both export-led and consumption-led. Germany, export-led growth. Italy, unfortunately, because it's the country where I was born, neither one nor the other. Okay, so let me just say a few words in highly stylized terms about these growth models. Let me start with the consumption-led growth model. That's the UK. It is characterized by endemic current account deficits. This is a growth model which lives beyond its means, so to speak. And so you have an accumulation of foreign debt and accumulation of domestic debt because you also have a growth of household debt, as I will show. Now, if you have that kind of persistent current account deficit, at some point you'll be forced to rebalance. But you're not forced to rebalance because the rest of the world wants to have your assets denominated in your currency in their portfolio. Why? I argue because of the presence of a large and liquid financial center, which is the City of London. So the City of London and finance, I will say later, has a systemic role, plays a systemic role for this growth model. Then what happens is interesting. Consumption-led growth creates favorable labor market conditions for labor demand in services, including medium and low services. So you will see that there's also healthy real wage growth in this economy, including in the low-skilled service sector. The German export-led growth model is almost the polar opposite. Here you have a large and growing export sector, which is the key sector, endemic current account surpluses, and I think the graphs sort of pointed to that, almost a trade-off between expanding consumption, domestic demand, and expanding exports. In order to expand exports, you have to keep a lid on domestic demand. Why? Because you don't want wage militancy. You don't want nominal wages to increase too much and reduce your external competitiveness. So there is this sort of trade-off, but the trade-off and the costs of the model are not equally distributed. They are very unequally distributed. I will show you that there is real wage growth. It's generally low in Germany before the crisis, but where there is real wage growth is mostly in the manufacturing sector, whereas the service sector has a flat wage curve. And in the service sector, you also see a growth of atypical employment, especially after the early 2000s. Now, the Swedish model hits the sweet spot. It's able to have both buoyant domestic demand and a respectable export performance. Why? The argument that I make with this colleague from Geneva by the name of Jonas Pontusson, who's actually Swedish, is that there has been structural adjustment in Sweden differently from Germany. Sweden has been moving away from relatively price-sensitive manufacturing. Manufacturing is still important in Sweden, but much less important than in Germany. And the movement has taken place towards first hardware and software, and then high value-added services, particularly business services, which are less price-sensitive. So there is less of a need, because there's less of a trade-off, to repress domestic consumption in order to stimulate foreign demand. And like in the UK, you see considerable real wage growth, not just in manufacturing, but also in the service sectors. And then Italy, and unfortunately I can be very brief on the Italian case, because so after the crisis of wage-led growth that was in the pre-globalization phase, driven by real wage increases that would stimulate consumption and investments, but the economy would be relatively closed with little capital mobility. After the crisis of that model, there isn't an alternative growth driver. Real wage growth that could stimulate domestic demand is low. Debt expands, I'm talking about private debt, expands but not sufficiently, as I will show, and the fiscal stance is constantly restrictive because the country has primary surpluses every year since 1993, with the exception of 2009. Notwithstanding these primary surpluses, the public debt continues to grow. Why? It's an automatic phenomenon. It grows because the nominal growth rate is always below the rate of nominal interest paid on the stock of debt. So the debt tends to increase automatically because growth is flat. So a country in bad shape, the export sector is too small, so even if you do structural reforms in order to increase competitiveness, your export sector is not large enough to pull the whole economy. Exports are very price sensitive. That's what my regressions show. And the real exchange rate is uncompetitive, also due to the fact that it's in the euro, and the euro prevents nominal exchange rate adjustment. So this is the size of the export sectors. So the export sector as a percentage of GDP in the 4 countries, I just want to show, look at the blue line. This is Germany, and in 1960, Germany doesn't look very different from the UK. Sweden is a more open economy, but that's normal because it's a small country. But then look at what Sweden does, what Germany does. It becomes as export-oriented as Sweden, which is a much smaller country, and look at what happens to the other 2 countries. So the conclusion here is that the export sector is too small to be a growth driver for Italy, even in case Italy was able to address all the other problems of lack of competitiveness. This is household debt. This is the other driver of a consumption-led economy. Household debt increases between 1995 and 2007 in both countries which have a consumption driver, namely Sweden and the UK. It increases slightly in Italy, but starting from low levels. This is household debt, so private debt, and it declines in Germany. After the crisis, the level of debt decline as a percentage of GDP declines in the UK and continues to increase in Sweden. And this is real wage growth. So these are hourly wages. Hourly wages grow relatively fast in the 2 consumption-led economies, Sweden and the UK. The UK until 2007. After 2007, real wage growth is flat. Real wage growth is virtually non-existent in Italy and relatively small in Germany. And there's an interesting peculiarity about Germany that says something about the distribution of the cost of adjustment. This was real wage growth between 1974 and 1990 in 2 macro sectors. High-end manufacturing, these are all the manufacturing sectors except textile and except apparel. And the green line is low-end services. This is retail and restaurants and hotels. So low-end services and high-end manufacturing, they grow more or less in line with labor productivity. This is what a coordinated collective bargaining system does. It takes productivity increases from the sector that generates them and moves them to the sector that tends to be more sluggish. This is the same graph between 1991 and 2007. And look what happens. High-end manufacturing continues to grow in real wage terms in line with labor productivity approximately until 2005. Then there is a gap that opens. Real wages don't grow at all in the low-end services. So that's the big change in the German labor market. Coordinated wage bargaining no longer works as it used to work. In particular, no longer transfers productivity increases into real wages, which also explains why aggregate demand is so low and contributes so little to growth, to German growth in this period. Now, let me, if I have a few minutes, let me just say a few words about the action behind. What is the politics of these growth models? I would argue, actually I do argue, that when a growth model is very clearly identifiable, say an export-led growth model, the German growth model, it has behind a dominant social bloc. What is a dominant social bloc? It's a coalition of forces, producer coalitions. So portions of capital, firms, and portions of labor, trade unions, having similar interests, striking cross-class alliances, but at the sectoral level. Okay, not in the economy as a whole. This is not Kalecki. It's at the sectoral level. And what is interesting about a dominant social bloc, and explains why I use this terminology that comes from Gramsci, is that the ability, a dominant social bloc produces a legitimating discourse, i.e., presents its interests, its bloc interests, as if they were the interest of the country as a whole. The common good, to use your expression. And persuades other actors that are not part of the bloc that that is the definition of the common good, of the national interest. Now, what does it mean that there are key sectors behind growth models? I would argue that sectors have requirements, and these requirements are not the same. So, for example, the requirements of the export-oriented manufacturing sector are very different from the requirements of the nexus between finance and construction, which are the two key sectors behind the UK consumption-led growth model. The requirements of an export-led growth model hinge, in particular, on real exchange rate sensitivity. You want to keep the real exchange rate underappreciated. What do you do that? How do you do that? Well, if you are in the euro, you rely on a fixed nominal exchange rate, and you combine that by producing wage moderation and levels of domestic inflation which are lower than anywhere else. That gives you real exchange rate depreciation. And if your manufacturing sector is sufficiently price sensitive, that gives you a leg up vis-a-vis your competitors. If your key sectors are finance, mortgage finance, and the construction sector, which I would argue were the key sectors in the UK economy, then what you're interested in, the key policy parameter, is the real interest rate. You want a real interest rate which is low enough to stimulate, yes, I'm done, to stimulate investment in housing. And for that, I'm going to cut a long story short, you need to disentangle house price inflation from wage inflation. You want to keep wage inflation in check, because if it's not in check, the central bank will intervene and will increase interest rates. At the same time, we want house prices to go up so that the housing market continues to move. Finally, on party politics. If a growth model is very clearly defined, then I would predict policy convergence. Mainstream parties will no longer compete on fundamental alternatives. They will compete in managing the requirements of the growth model, of the social bloc. So there will be policy convergence, which is dangerous, though, because if the growth model doesn't produce a sufficient amount of growth and doesn't distribute growth sufficiently well, then you will have new parties emerging that are catering to those who are dissatisfied with the social bloc. There is the following problem with growth models. The numerical dimension of the bloc is always below 50% of the voters. So if you put together firms and workers, say in the manufacturing sector, you don't even make 30%. You need to get to 50%. How do you get to 50%? Part of that is the cultural reinterpretation. You persuade a sufficient number of voters that the interests that you are pursuing at the policy level are in their interest as well, for example, in the national interest. But you also have to do old-style redistribution. And then the problem becomes, does the old-style redistribution get in the way of some of the requirements of the growth model? Okay, I think I will stop there.